So we've been trying to focus a bit more of the work in the justice sector on what is the relationship between justice and poverty. So for us, for me, it meant kind of rethinking the equation, because as a lawyer, I always came into it as we have a justice problem. And I worked with poor people. I do pro bono here in Washington, D.C., and I said, well, I mean, these poor people have legal problems. If we solve the legal problem, it's going to solve their poverty, their vulnerability. That was a very naive view of how the world works, and this has kind of led to a rethinking of the equation, at least on my part, which is that the problem is poverty and inequality, and justice is part of the solution. So how do we make justice part of that solution? So first, when I'm talking about poverty, I like to look at it from the multidimensional view. So getting beyond just what's people's income, their expenditures, their consumption, and looking at the other factors that go into making people poor or vulnerable. So things like health problems and lack of access to health care, lack of education, problems with housing, problems with employment, problems with agency, being able to make decisions about my own life. I work a lot in the Middle East and North Africa. This is a big problem for women in particular. So then it becomes about, well, if justice is part of the solution, where is it part of the solution? So there's a lot of different ways, and you could go on for hours about this, but I want to make just a couple of key points. So the first is that justice we need to view as a bit of a tool for poor people and vulnerable people to hold governments accountable, particularly for non-delivery of public services. So I live in Colombia, I'm entitled to health care, it's my right, but the government isn't delivering it to me. What can I do about it? The other is, one of the more obvious, reform of legislative and regulatory frameworks. So, legislation is important. It sets the parameters, for your rights and for services that you need from your government. How does justice help us challenge them when they're not working to our favor, when legislation is discriminatory or legislation is inadequate? The third is cultural norms. So in a lot of the countries we work in, we have maybe decent legislative frameworks, but the cultural norms kind of shrink that space within the legislation. So for example, maybe a woman in the Middle East would have certain rights under the Constitution, but maybe a woman in Jordan goes into a bank and says, I want to open up a bank account, and they say, well, where is your husband? This type of thing happens quite often. So how does justice assist in that situation? And then finally is an issue we're looking at a lot when we talk about one of the World Bank's twin goals about inclusive growth is, the opposite of inclusion, exclusion. So how does exclusion work? For example, discriminatory framework, laws that discriminate against women or minorities, and how can justice help us challenge this exclusion? So practically, the work has gone across two fronts. So the first is we're trying to do a bit more research into understanding how exactly justice and poverty interact, and we're looking at legal problems. So you may say, why look at legal problems? There's a lot of evidence about legal problems from household surveys. So we know what people are complaining about, where they have legal problems, whether it's family law or criminal law or civil law. But legal problems also tell us a lot about the status of legislation, the status of public services, and the status of policy in a country. So, a country may have a great policy about targeting social safety nets to benefit poor people. But if it's not working and a lot of people are complaining about lack of access to the social safety net, then you have a problem. So we're looking, kind of the research, how do we understand this relationship? And the other is, what we call in the bank operations. So, the bank does projects. So with this, we're trying to pilot different modes of service delivery, different type of services to benefit poor people. So, one of the most common is legal aid services. So we work in, I think, about 7 or 8 different countries now, helping to develop legal aid services. So I have a legal problem, I need advice, I need information, I need counseling, I need a lawyer. The bank does a lot on judicial modernization as well. How can we improve court services to make them more accessible for everyone, to make them more speedy, to make them less corrupt. So that's kind of the big picture. So I hope that this will at least spur some of the discussion. So please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that overview. So we also know that climate change is very much a justice issue. So the World Bank president, Jim Kim, has often said, we'll never end poverty if we don't tackle climate change. Because we know that if we do not solve this generational crisis, we're in a way condemning up to 100 million people to enter poverty. So the solution to climate change is also very much the solutions to a lot of the justice issues. So I'd like to hand over now to Victoria, who's got a few questions and comments of your own. So Victoria is one of the plaintiffs on a legal case against the US government, and she can also pick up probably on the intergenerational justice question and how to deal with that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that it's really amazing already that you recognize the disparities between certain communities and the effects that climate change is going to have on them. And I think that it's particularly interesting, of course I'm biased in this, but I think it's interesting to look at it from the perspective of youth, where the term youth already embodies a lot of demographics. I'm a young person, my fellow ACE over there is another young person, but we have different demographics that we fit into. And I think it's interesting. I think my question to you would be, what is the World Bank doing, or what are you doing in your position at the World Bank to discuss how youth are being disproportionately impacted by climate change?
Okay, I will try to answer as best as possible, because as I was explaining to our organizers, I don't have a huge background in climate change. It's not something that I normally work on, but this is why for me it's interesting to come to something like this and get your feedback, because I mean, one thing I've noticed is in doing these type of events is that I learn a lot of things that I didn't think to look at before. So to give you an example, with the research that we've been doing now on legal problems and poverty, we've been piloting the data collection in two upper middle income countries, in Jordan and Colombia. And we did it in these countries because we had big household surveys. And I met with someone who's an advisor on disabilities, and they started talking about, well, you know, people with disabilities have a huge number of legal problems. And I thought, really? It's not something I ever thought about. It's not something I'd ever seen. Let me check. So we went back to the household survey in Colombia, and they asked a question about whether people reported having a disability. And then we kind of disaggregated the data, and we thought, yeah, you're right. I mean, they have a huge number of problems. That was kind of, you know, surprising to me. So this is great because it also gives me the idea that, you know, we need to go back and look at the data when it comes to climate change. I would think that, you know, in certain contexts, you'll see that, you know, poor people will report certain type of legal problems that wealthier people won't report. You know, like land disputes is a big issue. So people fighting over ownership of land or boundaries of land or usage of land. And I think that in a lot of countries we work in, this is very much climate driven. You know, as the productivity of land shrinks, as access to water becomes more complicated, people start to fight over things. So this is an area that I think actually we need to start looking a lot more at. From the area of youth, this is also interesting because colleagues had brought this up to me earlier as well, and with the research we've been doing, we went back and we looked at the household surveys, and again we disaggregated data based on youth, and we found that the younger someone is, the more likely they are to report the legal problem. So now we need to go back and start understanding, well, you know, what type of legal problems and why exactly are they having these type of legal problems. So I mean, I guess that, you know, the approach that we're doing is we're just trying to understand how all of this justice impacts different type of communities over different issues. So I think climate is a great place to start looking. It's not something that had really struck me before, and youth as well. So, I mean, we're trying to look at through perspective of gender, through perspective of youth, through perspective of poverty. There's so many different ways that you can look at these issues once you start to collect the data. So it's great to get kind of advice on this front.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and Victoria, maybe you could enlighten us a little bit on how you're using the legal system to advocate for climate action.
Yeah, well, as a young person, I recognized early on my stake in climate change, especially in the United States, and so I'm currently a plaintiff on a lawsuit against the U.S. federal government for through their action, failing to protect me from my constitutional right to life, liberty, and property. And I think that the most interesting thing that I found being a plaintiff on this lawsuit is just the fact that people don't realize the amount of power they have when it comes to the decisions that their governments make. And not even just young people, anybody. Anybody has like a certain amount of autonomy and power when it comes to being an engaged citizen. And I was wondering how you think, not just in the United States, but internationally, how more people could be educated on how to be civically engaged in, and it doesn't necessarily mean having to sue your government, because I can understand why that's a broad and maybe scary idea, but just any way for civic engagement to be taught and for the idea of it to be spread through certain communities that maybe feel like they have the same voice and ability to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I think that there's several different levels that you could address it on. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems is kind of what we call legal literacy. So people don't always really understand what their legal rights are. They don't understand when their rights are being infringed upon. A bigger problem is kind of the legal literacy of what do I do about it? You know, what court can I go to? How do I make a complaint? I mean, it would be fascinating to hear from you how you even figured out that you could sue the U.S. government. I mean, this is really incredible. You know, it's complicated, and this is probably one of the biggest problems with the justice sector is that, you know, as a lawyer, I'm often a bit ashamed at the extent to which legal systems have been made so incredibly complicated. When I moved back to Washington, I started doing pro bono in Washington, D.C. at the Superior Court in family law. I went to court for the first time, and I was completely lost. I was utterly confused. I couldn't figure out what was going on and what people were supposed to do. And, you know, I have a legal education. It should be easier for me to understand. I don't understand how people who don't have a lawyer would possibly navigate the system. And this is a big problem. And, you know, the last level is that, you know, like what you're doing, we would consider public interest litigation. I mean, you're starting a lawsuit that's in the public's interest. I mean, if you win your case, this is going to have a huge positive impact on a lot of people. And this is really an excellent tool in countries that have, you know, functioning judicial systems of, you know, how do you bring a case about something as big as climate change? I mean, it's easier to do something maybe on smaller scale. So if, you know, you're a community that's living next to a coastal area which is now perpetually flooding without any relief from your government because of climate change, I mean, that's, you know, smaller scale and straightforward. But, you know, what you're doing is really quite impressive. So I think the bank is trying to be a bit better about developing legal literacy and making sure people understand what rights they have and how they can exercise them, and also building into a lot of the bank's projects what we call citizen engagement. So making sure that all of the bank's projects at least have some mechanism where ordinary citizens can engage with the project, whether it's through complaints or oversight, but making sure that there's some role for citizens.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. We've got 2 questions here. Do we have any microphones floating around the room? Yeah, there is a mic coming to the front. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's valuable the approach that you say about for example, the impact of justice and legal framework on poverty. Also, I know that it is related of government and how institutions interact with the society as well. So I was concerned about what is the impact, for example, of social connections that people may have access in order to build community policies that may tackle poverty, and also how can we address facts of vulnerability and resilience in impact evaluation strategies. I like the case that you mentioned about people with disabilities in Colombia. Actually, I am working in a project for people with disabilities in Nepal, in Kathmandu. Basically, it's a program that is directing an entrepreneurship project for people with disabilities. And this NGO is trying to connect them with the economic development processes of the country as well. But basically, it's trying to focus on how to make them independently. And in doing so, it is important to address, for example, legal literacy strategies and citizen engagement framework, because at the same time, it's like how they can understand better what does the program work in that sense. So, yeah, my question is basically, what is the impact of social connections in building community policies?
I think we might as well collect another question and then move on to it.
Hi, I'm a lawyer here in DC as well. I grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, and the Jamaican government was a recipient of several World Bank loans, and a lot of the money that went towards the government was not used for education or infrastructure projects that it was supposed to be used for. So my question is, what processes and mechanisms does the World Bank have to hold these loany governments accountable when they misuse funds? Thank you.
Great, let's answer those two.
Yeah, I think social connections are incredibly important. When we talk about justice and court system, I mean, people naturally start to think of, the court system. I have a problem, I go to court. And as a lawyer who's been in court, I mean, I think courts are probably the least efficient way of addressing problems, whether they're social or economic or political. They're expensive, they're complicated, they take a long time. The best way to resolve issues is to do it without having to go to court. I mean, you need functioning courts, obviously, as that last step in protection when you really need them. But social connections are really important, and this is, I think, goes to the issue of inclusion and exclusion we were talking about. So the extent to which governments are inclusive and they allow for these social connections to have some type of influence in the government, regardless of your social status, your economic status, your racial status, your linguistic status, that you still have the ability to have some interaction with government, and the government is interacting with you as well. When we looked at data about legal problems and how people solve legal problems, social connections were really important. For example, with the survey in Jordan, we found that men were much more likely to resolve problems amicably or through professional associations or through family associations. Women didn't really have that option. Women were stuck going to court or just living with the dispute. So I think that the whole issue of social connections is extremely important. The difficult part becomes when you start talking about social norms, because a lot of the social norms in the countries we work in are kind of against social connections and social exclusion. So the question always becomes, how do you try to influence these type of social connections, which isn't the easiest thing. On your question about, I mean, this is a bit outside of my area, but I mean, the bank has an integrity department. The integrity department takes complaints about any type of corruption involving bank projects or misuse of bank funds. So that would normally be the first, kind of the most dramatic option if there was really type of an abuse taking place. Other than that, most bank projects now should have this kind of citizen engagement, this grievance redress mechanisms attached to them. So, for example, if the community feels that they're not being consulted with, or that money isn't being well spent, or that services aren't being delivered properly, they can make a complaint related to the project. But if it's not kind of project related and it's really about kind of high-level corruption, then the bank's integrity unit would get involved.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to open it up for another one or two questions.
I have a question for you. So the concept of justice varies greatly depending on what culture you're from. And studies have shown that different groups of people will feel differently as to what is just and what is unjust. So how does the World Bank and you handle cultural expectations as to what is just and what is unjust?
Thanks. Let's take another one from the front.
Hello. So I'm currently studying international health at Georgetown University, and I know for a fact that culture and health are very closely related. It impacts every aspect of health policy in the country. So culture obviously has a massive impact on the country. And building off the previously asked question, how does culture, play into the poverty condition of the country? And when making social policy, how is culture sort of addressed in the policy?
Okay, on the first question, it's a big question, the concept of justice. We could go on for quite a long time about this. I mean, personally, from my view, coming from a human rights background, I like to look at the different aspects of international human rights and what this tells us about the justice. That's always kind of my starting point. When we work individually with countries, you also want to look at their domestic legislation, their culture, to get a concept of what is and isn't justice. Sometimes I try to differentiate between what I do. I mean, sometimes it's access to justice, and sometimes it's just really about access to services. And I think we confuse the two phrases quite often. To give you an example, if a young woman in Morocco is raped by an older man, and her family goes to a legal aid center to make a complaint, and the legal aid center gets the public prosecution involved, and the public prosecution starts an investigation, and the case goes to court, she got access to services. If the judge then turns around and tells the rapist, if you marry her, we'll drop the charges, it's not really access to justice. And she got access to the services, but not the justice. And this is a continuing debate in all of the countries we work in. I mean, I keep going back to the gender example because it's something I've worked in. But we have huge differences of opinions with most of the countries we work on the concept of gender justice and gender equality. So I think it's kind of an ongoing discussion. I try to think of it as, basic rights are universal, and that's something we have to stick to. I mean, when you talk about services, I think there's a bit more room, wiggle room we call it. So for example, if alternative dispute resolution or mediation is much more common in a certain culture than going to court, then that's obviously something that should be promoted. If using, what we call customary norms and customary law as opposed to formal law is something that's respected within the community, that's also something you can engage with so long as you know that it's at least consistent with standards of human rights. The second question was about, no, I'm sorry, I didn't write it down. It was about culture.
The impact of culture on the poverty condition of the country, and how the cultural dynamics are addressed in a social program for that country.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. It would probably be better for one of my colleagues from the social protection unit who designs the kind of social safety nets, or a colleague from poverty that does the poverty mapping. I can talk to you about it from kind of the justice perspective, is that culture has a huge influence, even how justice is perceived and how justice is implemented. For the example I used from Jordan, I mean, we started a legal aid services program in Jordan, and the vast majority, we do it with civil society, not with the government, and the majority of beneficiaries are women, because women find it culturally more difficult to go to formal institutions. So I think after 5 years, still 72% of the beneficiaries are women. So when we started opening the legal aid centers in some of the more rural, conservative areas of Jordan, what we did is we put lawyers in existing civil society organizations rather than set up a legal aid center. And this was partly practical. We didn't, have the resources to set up a specific center everywhere. But one of the most interesting things that came out of that was that women who got the who benefited from accessing the lawyers told us, if you set up a legal aid center, we would have never gone. But because you set up a lawyer in an existing NGO that no one knows is legal, I could go. Because if I walked into a legal aid center, my husband's cousin might see me and, I would have a problem. So, yeah, I mean, culture is so incredibly important in the way that it constrains rights and services. And addressing that is complicated because a lot of it is about changing cultural norms, and there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of activities around this, but it's very difficult to discern how to effectively change cultural norms.
Thank you, Paul. We've unfortunately run out of time and we have to move right along. So I just want to thank you so very much. Paul, you heard it from Paul Prettitore on the interlinkages between justice and poverty, how poverty is reinforced by lack of justice and how you can use justice to also alleviate poverty. And then you heard it from Victoria Barrett, our youth activist, that poverty and climate change is closely aligned, and that climate change is also a justice issue for this generation and the next generation, and how you can use the law to help encourage climate action and climate solutions. Thank you so very much.
And I just want to say thank you, and also because I'm trying to get the bank a bit better about dissemination of the work that we do, I have a Twitter account, so it's Prettitore. Please feel free to follow me because I'm trying to disseminate as much information we have about this, and it's always great to get feedback from what people think is important and what we should be doing as well. Thank you.